Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we come at last to the Civil War.
Alrighty, so welcome back to my channel, The Modern Josephus. Today I'm going to react to the Civil War Part 1. So let's see what I disagree with, or what I agree with, and we'll go from there. Welcome back. Alright, let's get this going.
Conflict that in many ways created a nation. So here's what you won't be getting today. We will not be describing battles and tactics. If that's your bag, might I suggest Ken Burns, or if you prefer books, like 1,000 authors, my favorites being James McPherson and Shelby Foote. And
So I have never read James McPherson before. I know he's one of the famous ones, but I've never read him. I've read Bruce Catton. He has a whole bunch of books, and I like him a lot. And right now I'm reading Shelby Foote, which is, I'm surprised he read it, because it's a more, Shelby Foote is more biased toward the Confederacy. So, but yeah, anyway, a lot of Civil War books out there to read.
Number two, we won't be bashing and or praising Abraham Lincoln very much, although we do have multiple Lincolns here because we've heard that's good for ratings. I mean, to watch or read certain accounts, you would think that the Civil War was a lengthy chess game played by Abraham Lincoln against his cunning opponent, Abraham Lincoln. But of course, there were other people involved. We are going to quote a fair bit of Lincoln, though, because, you know, that won Tony Kushner an Academy Award nomination. Three, we won't be claiming that the Civil War was somehow secretly about something other than slavery, because that is just so early 20th century. And number four, there will not be a lot of jokes today because 700,000 people died.
Mr. Green, actually only 680,000 people died.
Yeah, it depends on how you count, you sniveling little ghoul. But recent estimates are between 680,000 and 800,000 total casualties, deadlier for Americans than the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined.
Yeah, and actually, my ancestor's brother actually died while he was serving in the Union. He died of disease, not in battle, but he's buried at Antietam Cemetery.
So let's start with some basic facts about the American Civil War. 1861 to 1865, which corresponded with the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, the Union, or more colloquially, the North, fought against the forces of the Confederate States of America, or the South. Sometimes people call the Union the blue and the Confederates the gray, but in fact, the uniforms weren't very uniform. They were all different kinds of color.
Like the movie or the show, The Blue and the Gray. It's actually interesting because at the Battle of First Bull Run, they didn't have any, there were uniforms of all colors there, and even some Confederates have blue uniforms. If you watch the movie Gods and Generals, you'll see Stonewall Jackson wearing blue, General Stewart, Jeb Stuart wearing blue, and there were Confederate forces that were wearing blue, so it got confusing in that battle, to say the least.
And also, with all that dirt and blood, they were all just brown. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. You'll notice from this map that not all the states that held slaves were part of the Confederacy. The border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland allowed slavery and never left the United States. All of these border states were critical to the Union. Maryland was north of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River. Missouri was the gateway to the West. Delaware actually wasn't that important. So none of that should be particularly controversial.
Now, it is funny that, well, not funny, but here's some interesting tidbits. Some people will say that Maryland only stayed in because they arrested a whole bunch of men from the Maryland legislature and put them in prison in Fort McHenry, which is true that they did arrest some of them. And then Kentucky is interesting because Kentucky declared neutrality. They said, we're not going to be of the Union, we're not going to be of the South. But if your forces touch the soil of Kentucky first, then we will join the other side. Well, I think it was General Bragg, if I remember right. Either General Bragg or General Johnston. One of those two. They ended up moving into Kentucky. The Union moved into Kentucky, and Kentucky joined the Union because the Confederates had broken the neutrality first.
unless you're from Delaware. But the causes of the war, that's another story.
In Missouri, it was basically a civil war. That's what it turned out to be, a civil war within a civil war.
Civil War was about slavery. Actual historians will back me up on this, like David Goldfield, who wrote, "Both Northerners and Southerners recognized slavery as the immediate cause of the Civil War."
Yeah, like I mentioned in the 1860 video, there was a cabal of Southern plantation owners who were in the government of South Carolina, and they basically had already decided that they were going to split the Union before the election of 1860, which is why Breckinridge ended up on the Democrat ballot, because they on purpose sabotaged the Democrats' chances in order for Lincoln to be elected, so that then they could just secede. And they were all plantation owners, all pro-slavery, and they were the super pro-slavery part of South Carolina.
Also, Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was, somehow, the cause of the war. That said, in comments, lots of people will be like, the war was about agriculture versus industry, or the states' rights to protect themselves from the tyranny of a big federal government. But if it were really about that, the Civil War would have started during the nullification crisis in the 1830s, when, as I'm sure you'll remember, Andrew Jackson said that South Carolina couldn't declare a federal tariff null in their state. Why didn't that cause a civil war?
Yep, and also, I wanted to come back here because there was something I read that one of these people said.
The war was about agriculture versus industry, or the states' rights to protect themselves.
Okay, the states' rights to protect themselves from the tyranny of the big federal government. Lincoln, I even acknowledged in his inaugural address that if a government becomes tyrannical, that states do have a right to raise up against it if it violates the Constitution. However, Lincoln hadn't even violated the Constitution yet. I mean, they were seceding before he even became president. So you don't really have a ground to say, oh, he's violating our rights when nobody has violated your rights yet. Now, what they should have done is stayed in the Union, and then if Lincoln would have started violating their constitutional rights and would have declared himself a dictator and said, all your slaves are now free, and if you don't free them, I'm going to send in my troops, then you would have had a correct reason under the name of states' rights to leave. But the South didn't do that. They decided to leave beforehand. They knew that Lincoln wasn't going to take away their slaves. Actually, when Lincoln comes into power, the Democrats control Congress. And what did the Democrats believe? They all believed the southern states had a right to own slaves. All the northern Democrats did believe that. And the second thing they all believed was popular sovereignty. So each state could decide on the question of slavery. And I don't even believe that was what the Founding Fathers intended, but they believed that. And Lincoln did not have a majority in Congress. The Republicans didn't take Congress. So eventually they did in the election after that. They took over Congress. But in Lincoln's first term, it was mostly Democrat controlled. All right. So there wasn't much he could do to end slavery if he wanted to. But he had already said in many speeches that he had no intention of freeing the slaves because he didn't have that constitutional right to do so.
The Confederate government passed the first conscription act in American history, implemented national taxes, created a national currency, and had a government bureaucracy of about 70,000 people, more than the federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Thought Bubble. That said, in the beginning of the war, Lincoln deliberately tried to downplay the slavery angle, arguing that the war was only about preserving the Union.
Well, here's what I always say. For the North, it was about preserving the Union, keeping it together. That's how they viewed it. They had no reason and had no intention of freeing slaves. And but the South, it was about slavery. There's no way you can get around it. Sorry, there's not.
But the war was also about religion for both sides. As David Goldfield put it, in protecting the revolutionary ideals, Northerners would preserve God's plan to extend democracy and Christianity across an unbroken continent and around the world. Southerners welcomed a war to create a nation more perfect in its fealty to God than the one that they had left. But it's also important to remember that regular soldiers often had more prosaic reasons for going off to fight, as you will eventually learn when you are forced to read the Red Badge of Courage. Goldfield tells the story of one Alabamian who enlisted only after his girlfriend mailed him a dress and told him he should start wearing it if he wasn't willing to fight. And for Northerners, union, religion, and an end to slavery mixed together to form a potent rationale for war. It's summed up nicely by Julia Ward Howe's words to the song that would become famous as the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
I had a friend from South Carolina that I met in college up in Indiana, and at the college we would sometimes sing this song. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And he wouldn't participate. We'd sing it in chapel services, and he wouldn't participate. It was funny.
As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. You thought I was going to sing, but you were wrong. So spoiler alert, the Union won the war.
Thank you for not singing John Green. Thank you.
Which in a sense is unsurprising because they had massive advantages. For starters, they had many more people, approximately 22 million as compared to 9 million in the South, of whom 3.5 million were slaves and therefore unlikely to be sympathetic to the Southern cause. Also, the North manufactured more than 90% of all goods in America. Its factories turned out 17 times more textiles than the South, 30 times more shoes and boots, 13 times more iron, and 32 times more firearms.
Wow, look at all those things there that didn't have to do with cotton and slavery. That's why this whole thing about, the Union benefited from slavery, or the North also benefited from slavery all the way up until the Civil War. It's not really true. All right, the textile industry was not as big as all the other things combined. There was so much more industry, and of course he's mentioning the ones that pertained more to what was going on. But there were more factories, there was whaling, there was all kinds of stuff. And the whaling also involved oil and stuff like that. So just so much farming, a lot of agriculture in the western part, in Indiana and Illinois, Iowa, a lot of farming. So yeah.
Plus, at the outbreak of the war, the North had 20,000 miles of railroad compared with the South's 10,000. This made it easier for the Union to move its army, which over the course of the war enlisted more than 2 million men compared with 900,000 for the Confederacy. Even Northern...
And another way you can tell that the Union didn't depend so much on cotton is because they were able to fight a war and clothe all their soldiers with cotton uniforms and not care about any of the cotton that was in the South.
Agriculture was more productive, taking greater advantage of mechanization than Southern farmers did. Really, the only advantage the South had was better military leaders, like most of the tactically famous generals of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, etc., were Southerners, and also, by the way, they all had great last words.
Yeah, it is frustrating as somebody from the North reading about the Army of the Potomac from 1861 to 1864. Just some of the worst generals ever on the Union side. The worst. Like dumb. Worst. And there were so many good, qualified corps commanders, division commanders, who would have been way better options than the guys that were rotated through commanding the Army of the Potomac. Literally.
Lee said, "Strike the tent." Stonewall Jackson said, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees." And Jeb Stuart, after being mortally wounded in battle, said to his close friend and lieutenant, "Honey bun, how do I look in the face?" Famous Union General Ulysses S. Grant's last word was water, which isn't nearly so good, but he said that last word after having survived the war and getting to be like President of the United States and stuff, right?
Yeah, Grant. The man. The man.
But anyway, this all raises an interesting question. Was the result of the war a foregone conclusion? The Confederacy had to create a nation from scratch and build national unity among people who were committed to the autonomy of their individual home states, so that's a problem. And then there was the issue of overcoming class conflicts, especially when the ruling class was often exempted from actually fighting in the war.
Yeah, it was a mess down there. If you ever read about the Confederate government, it was a mess. Literally. One reason probably why they lost is they couldn't even come together to do things. A lot of protests from the states. Some states wouldn't help, and it's here. You know what happened? They went back to the Articles of Confederation. That's what happens in confederations, and that's why the Confederation in the 1780s fell, and they had to come up with the Constitution, and that's why this Confederacy fell, because confederacies just don't work out. There's nothing to hold them together. In a constitutional republic, you have a constitution that binds them all together.
But when you put aside all that nation-building stuff and just focus on the actual fighting of the war, the question of the Union's inevitable win becomes much trickier. Some have argued that all the Confederacy really needed to do was outlast the Northern efforts to bring them back into the Union, like Washington had to do against the British. And the idea was that this war of attrition would eventually wear down Northern resolve. But there were two problems with this theory. First, the North had such superiority in its resources that it would take a long time to wear down. Secondly, fighting a war of attrition would be costly to the South as well, and their resources would be depleted long before the North's.
And this is why they were going to France and England for help, because they couldn't do it on their own. Like in the War for Independence, we had to go to France for help. However, the other bad problem is that in the American War for Independence, England was 3,000 miles away, so they had to bring their armies all the way over, and to feed and clothe their armies, they had to bring it all the way over across the ocean. During the Civil War, the Union had everything right there. I mean, you could bring in any of the necessary materials to the front lines within hours. Not even days, within hours you could bring it. Less than 24 hours, less than 10 hours sometimes, less than 5 hours. If it was in Philadelphia and they were supplying the Army of the Potomac, loaded it up on a train, and you can get it down there in, a few hours. So it was really, the Confederacy was not on good footing from the very beginning.
Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. Whoa! That was intense. I try to identify the author of the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked, but I'm never right because Stan makes it too hard. All right, let's see what we got today. I therefore determined first to use the greatest number of troops practicable against the armed force of the enemy, preventing him from using the same force at different seasons, and second, to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources, until by mere attrition there should be nothing left to him but submission. Okay.
I'm going to say Sherman or Grant.
So the strategy of attrition was a Confederate strategy, but Stan is a jerk. But it talks about the enemy and his resources, which was kind of a Union focus, and more importantly, it talks about preventing him from using the same force at different seasons. That makes me think it is a Union general. Final answer, Ulysses S. Grant. Yo-ho! How do you like them apples? Grant was different from previous Union generals in that he was willing to sustain enormous casualties in pursuit of his goal to wear down the South. Because of this, Grant was often branded a butcher, like he was willing to weather incredible losses, including the 52,000 men.
All right, to be honest, though, he wasn't called the butcher until 1864. So from 1861 to 1864, he wasn't known as the butcher. He was known as the Butcher after the Battle of Cold Harbor. He sent his soldiers against Confederate entrenchments like you see here, and a lot of them died. And then they were shipped up to Washington, D.C., where they just kind of overwhelmed the city. And he lost a lot of men. And I mean, you can say from the wilderness, but Cold Harbor is what got him finally the name I think it was actually Mrs. Lincoln that first called him the butcher.
41% of his army who were injured or killed at the battles of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. But his grim determination not just to defeat, but to destroy his opponent is what made Grant one of the first truly modern generals, and also the most successful leader the Union found. So Grant's brutal strategy, coupled with the vast superiority in northern resources, suggests that the outcome of the Civil War really
was the original general, OG. Got it. See that? See that? See that? Okay.
was inevitable, but it also points to some of the reasons to be cautious about that conclusion. First off, it took 3 years before the Union actually fully adopted Grant's strategy, and between 1861 and 1864, it was possible that Southern victories would eventually force the Union to give in. I mean, the Union lost a lot of battles in the first 2 years, largely due to ineffective...
Especially in the East. And that's probably where it was more important, was the East, because it was closer to New York, it was closer to Pennsylvania, it was closer to all those states. But in the West, I mean, they were in Mississippi by 1862. they were at the north part of Mississippi by 1862, so...
generaling, and nothing saps a nation's motivation for war like losing. Now, some argue that the North had superior motivation to prosecute the war because they had God on their side and they were against slavery, but that's also pretty problematic. I mean, for many men who joined the Federal Army, a war to end slavery had very little appeal, especially poor enlistees who might be afraid that newly freed slaves would compete with them for jobs.
All right, I don't know about all that. What I do know is this. So Lincoln, actually, and here's how I know that he was going to always respect states' rights to own slaves, is that when he came up with his Emancipation Proclamation, he gave the Confederates, I think, 3 months to cease the war, join the Union. And he said if they did that, his promise would be that he would never end slavery in the South during his terms. And he gave them 3 months to come back into the Union. But he said that if you don't join by January 1st, come back into the Union, then all slaves in your territory will be made free. And the South didn't take that offer, and they stayed in rebellion, and Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. Now, when he did that, a lot of Union soldiers, there were a lot of desertions. A lot of Union soldiers started deserting, and but they ended up replenishing the troops. My ancestors stayed, and they were able to keep on going again in the war. So most soldiers didn't see anything wrong with staying to free slaves. There were some who did, and they deserted or tried to, but the vast majority stayed to keep fighting.
Also, while we are correct in considering slavery unjust, Southerners who took up arms for the Confederacy saw themselves as engaged in a fight for their own freedom rather than a fight to protect slavery. The truth is, when it comes to fighting, motivation is a very tricky business, and I'm most comfortable agreeing with James McPherson, who argued that motivation waxes and wanes with victory, and that the outcome of the war was contingent on a number of turning points. As
Jeff Daniels says in Gettysburg, some came because they were bored at home. And that's just the truth. They said, oh, this looks like it might be fun. I'll just join. I'm not doing much here at home, so...
And we're just going to discuss two of the most important, July 1863 and August 1864. July 1863 saw two of the most important Union victories in the whole war. In the Western Theater, General Grant laid siege to and captured Vicksburg.
And that's a brilliant campaign. It's why he is the OG, original general. And, I mean, his campaign in Vicksburg was just awesome. Just great. Masterful. A masterpiece.
Mississippi, thus giving the Federals control of the lower Mississippi River. I mean, by then the North already had New Orleans, which made it pretty much impossible for the Confederates to ship cotton or anything else along the Mississippi River. After that, Grant was able to turn his attention to the east with the aforementioned hammering of the enemy and their resources. More famously, especially in the eastern part of the United States, the first 3 days of July 1863 saw the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. This was General Lee's furthest major offensive in the North, and had he won the battle, it is likely that panic would have set in places like Philadelphia and maybe even New York. Actually, panic did overcome New York in draft riots that killed more than 100 people and only ended after troops from Gettysburg were called in.
And some black Americans were hanged too.
I'm not going to go into detail about either of these battles, but they shifted the tide of the war in favor of the North, although not enough to bring the war to a quick end. Confederate forces would never again threaten a northern city. August 1864 saw another turning point that really spelled the doom of the Confederacy, and that was when Union General Sherman took Atlanta. Atlanta was a railroad hub and manufacturing center, but its capture was more significant politically than militarily.
He said something along the lines of, "Mr. President, I present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah," something like that.
Because it happened close to the election of 1864. And that American election was really the last time that the Confederate States of America could have won the Civil War. It's easy to forget this, but Lincoln actually had to run for re-election during the Civil War. And by the summer of 1864, the war was pretty unpopular, and it looked like Lincoln might lose. The capture of Atlanta changed public opinion about Lincoln, and it meant that his Democratic opponent and former top general, George McClellan, didn't stand a chance of winning, which was really significant for the war because Lincoln was committed to ending it with a Union victory, and McClellan,
So some people have said, there's that belief that he would have looked for peace. I think he actually ran on peace. However, by the time he would have taken the presidency, the war would have already been at its point where it was about to be wrapped up. By the time he took the presidency, he would have taken the presidency. Sherman would have already been marching through the north, and maybe even been in North Carolina by then. The siege of Petersburg would have still been going on, but Grant was getting troops, and by that point they were kind of shaky. The Confederates were not looking like they were going to hold onto that a lot or any longer, or for much time longer. Richmond, there was food scarcity going on in Richmond and things like that. So McClellan probably would have kept on going with the war because it was over by that point. I will say though that the Union soldiers are what kept Lincoln in office. They decided to open up the voting for Union soldiers, and they overwhelmingly voted Lincoln.
I think it says a lot about American history that in the end, the war's outcome was ensured not just by military victories, but by a political one. Next week, we'll examine the effects of the Civil War and the enduring questions that have arisen out of it, such as who exactly freed the slaves. But until then, thanks for watching.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see his point of view, see if I agree or disagree. But yeah, this was a good video. I liked it. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, comment down below if you disagree with me, or even if you agree with me. Give me a thumbs up or a few thumbs up. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and yeah, adios.